The following is a story called Stoking the Flames. It was written by Nonsequitur for Emeral, who also commissioned this reading. It's about his Flareon OC Flarita. There's going to be Pokemon elements involved in this. You know, I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always this red-hot bombshell you see before you. Hard to believe, I'm sure. I don't think it's easy to imagine me without guns like these. Those were different times back then. You probably wouldn't believe it, but I was actually born and raised in a mansion. Like royalty even. Even back then, though, I was still top of the line. As Eevees, my siblings and I were bred for quality. We were peak specimens of our species. My mother, an Espeon, has a stunning pedigree. Our owners were very proud of us, and me in particular. They loved to stroke my fur and scratch behind my ears just right. Oh, it was heavenly. Problem was, those old fuddy-duddies were a little too doting on me. It was cute for a while they pampered me, but as I grew older, I got less and less interested in it. Not like most of my siblings. The family still treated me like I was some newborn kid, giving me all those baby talk coos like I couldn't understand anything more complicated than Eevee want a treat. The kids were the worst part of it all. Edmund and Priscilla, I think their names were. They just wanted me to play with them all the time, keep brushing my fur and putting me in all these outfits. You'll never believe one Pokemon could have so many bows tied to them. Yes, I see that look you're giving me. I know this sounds very bizarre, but trust me, it'll all make sense. So to show my displeasure with it all, I started to get a little rowdy. I'd shake out those bows and run circles all around them while they cried at me to stop. I would have run all day if I could, laps up and down the stairs in that big house, but my little Eevee legs back then could only work so hard. Sooner or later I'd have to get tired, and then they'd pick me up by the scruff of my neck and they'd be scolding me. I was almost okay with that, though. Better to be disciplined than being babied incessantly. It became apparent to them eventually that I wasn't just going to roll over and play nice anymore, and they didn't want that. Not at all. They were part of this long family line, you see. They have all these customs and traditions that they just couldn't get rid of. They didn't want me to get into any kind of trouble. That'll just ruin all the hard work they put into getting me in the first place. No reason to worry about any possibility like that. The worst part of it all was that they refused to allow me to evolve. They were only interested in Eevees. They didn't want me to get anything remotely close to a fight. They even have a whole display case full of evolution stones, and they wouldn't let me get any of them. They were just for decoration. I mean, who does that? I shouldn't be letting myself get worked up so quickly. There's still a lot to go through. The tipping point in it all came one day when I managed to do the unthinkable. I escaped the mansion. It happened when there was a big party going on. That meant a lot of more people in the building. Meaning owners parading me and my family to them over and over again, and the petting would never end. I didn't have it in me to deal with that. So while they had a door open to let the guests in, I slipped out from between their big legs and fresh air immediately filled my lungs. They never let us go outside before, though it was too much of a risk. I could only ever see the grounds with all its flowers and trees through the windows. To actually run through the grass among them. Over the hills and fields, the wind in my fur. That was so much more than I ever could have imagined. I saw other Pokemon for the first time, wild ones. I couldn't really understand any of them very well. My isolation had prevented me from learning how to interact with other species properly. Not that it made much difference. In my excitement, my natural instinct had been to run after them, causing more of them to run away, little birds and rodents too scared by a tiny little Eevee. I felt the thrill for the first time. It didn't last long. Eventually, I heard voices, loud footsteps approaching at a run. I stayed out of reach for as long as I could, but eventually they caught up to me. They brought me back to the mansion again. They were mad at me, my owners. Mad I ran away, and on a day of a party no less. Forcing them to break up the festivities to put together a search party. They've had enough of my disobedience. Eventually, I was not the first case of such behavior in the family's history, because they already had the necessary punishment prepared for me. They call it a harness, but in practice, it might as well have been a straitjacket. It was a bulky, padded thing that they tried to tie me into, clamping around my back and legs and neck, even my tail, and made it so I could barely move. I couldn't escape anymore. I could only stand still like I was just a toy to them. Oh, Emmett and Priscilla, they like it a lot. Now they could play with me as much as they wanted, and there was no resistance I could put up. All those bows and ribbons, all over again, and I couldn't get rid of them. It took all my strength just to put one paw in front of the other. Reaching up to claw them was out of the question. I remember at the end of that first day with the harness on, I went back to the room where my family slept. The owners like to call it the fox run. I just thought of it as the pound. My siblings didn't want to snuggle up with me anymore when we were to sleep. They thought all those padded metal bits made me too uncomfortable. They didn't lift a paw to help me out of it either, though they didn't want to incur the wrath of our masters upon them as well. They were just as much a part of the problem at the end of it all. They were content with being pampered day in and day out, didn't mind the patronization of it all, so long as they were fed and didn't have to worry about all those things out there in the real world. Only my mother would still approach me. She let me rest against her, and I felt the warmth of her body even through the harness. Espions may have short fur, but she had let herself go over the years and gotten a little soft around the edges. I asked her why it was that she allowed herself to stay here, to be spoiled so much. Her mewling laughter rumbled through me. She licked my cheek and said she already had her time in the sun. She just wants to have a family. I didn't understand. Deep down, I was still frustrated with her, but those nights with her were the only solace I had back then. Got a little lost in thought there. Where was I? Oh, right. Damn harness. So I could only assume the owners expected that it would only be a matter of time before I gave up on my own ways and roll over for them. In the mornings I'd wake up and embark on the long trek down to the kitchen where I could eat breakfast. Before I would bound across the floor and down the stairs like wildfire, but now I have to walk with my legs all stiff. Edmund and Priscilla would see me and laugh, think it was cute how hard I was acting. One of them would pick me up and carry me down, yowling all the while for them to put me down. The father of the house, the one who put the harness on me, I think it was Aloysius or something. One of those names that stopped being used a century ago. He would look at me and ask if I was behaving, or I felt like behaving. I still doubt that any of them actually understood Pokemon speech, so the most accurate response I could give him was just sticking out my tongue. What none of them realized, even myself for a while, was that the harness was actually doing more harm than good. It was intended to incentivize an Eevee to do as little as possible, the perfect little lap fox who would just sit around and look cute, but I just kept pushing myself anyway. As days wore on, I started to grow used to it. It wasn't long before I could muster a slightly more acceptable walking speed and I could just jump again, even if only less than a foot. The others didn't want us to get roughed up to get involved with battling, and even just exercising was out of the question, but the harness was better than any macho brace I ever used. Soon enough, I was able to move just as easily with the harness on as I had before it was inflicted upon me. It did me great happiness to hear the old metal joints and springs squealing as I forced them to buckle more than they were supposed to, but I could also feel the aching burn in my muscles from their development, tensing and flexing as I moved, and that was even better. I was careful not to show it, however. I didn't want them to know just how capable I could be. I needed to have the element of surprise on my side. It wasn't hard for me to find another opportunity to escape. If there's one thing that having to move so agonizing slow taught me, it was to take better notice of my surroundings. I observed all the ways in and out of the house and determined what would be the best means of access. A door is too easy. They'd be watching me there. A window was what I needed, and in those balmy early autumn days, it was an ideal time to have the windows open. With no one looking, I leaped through one of the glass openings, and I didn't hear the shouting until I was at the far end of the estate grounds. It wasn't enough to just claw at the harness's bindings to get rid of it. I had to bash against trees and rocks for a while until it was loose enough for me to pry it off. The metal bits fell all around me, and I stood there like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon into the sunlight. The relief was the most heavenly thing I've ever experienced in my life up to that point. and I was riding high off its adrenaline. I needed to get my blood pumping. It happened as I wandered through the forest that I came upon another Pokemon. I think that looked like a ball of fur with a face and limbs projecting out of it. Mankey, I think. I know now. Didn't seem like a particularly pleasant fellow even before it noticed me, grunting and snorting about as it sifted through the bushes. And when it did meet my gaze, it proceeded to shriek and stamp its feet. Some inner instinct that has been repressed for all my life recognized this as a challenge, and my hackles raised as I growled back at it. And the two of us sprang for each other. The Mankey was wild, swiping madly, but I was quick enough to avoid it. Of course, I didn't know any real moves at that point. All I could do was butt my head against it and hope for the best. I got a few good hits before it connected with a blow to my side, and that sent me flying against a tree. I couldn't get up after that, and the brute loomed over me, glaring angrily. Not sure if at that point I really comprehended what death could have been, but then it left back into the other bush. As I lay there, breathing hoarsely, aching beyond any capacity I could have imagined before, I still found myself smiling in spite of it all, because I had never felt more alive. When I woke up, they had already found me and brought me back to the mansion. They were even angrier now that I had disobeyed them. Not only had I broke the harness, but I'd gone so far as to get myself all bruised up and dirty. After getting cleaned up, they brought out a surprise, a new harness that was even sturdier and bulkier than the last one. I imagined they expected I would be distraught over it, but all I could really do was sigh. I'd broken free once already. What was to stop me from doing it again? So that's how things progressed for the next few weeks. I continued to bolster my strength with the restraining force of the harness, and every time it became apparent that I have outstripped it, they brought a new one, even more effective than the last one. You'd think they would have learned eventually, but they seemed to be convinced I would have to give up eventually. What they did learn from was my escape attempts, and they increased security on the mansion after the second time. I only ever got outside one more time. That didn't last long. But boy, how did I give them a run for the money. They hired professionals, presumably with the intent of improving my behavior, but ultimately all they really served was to keep an eye on me. They had to rotate them out fairly frequently. I suspect because they either get sick of the job, or in some cases they realized that keeping me locked up wasn't the right way to go. There was one caretaker who particularly was friendly to me. Didn't see me as a problem in need of fixing like the others, just a Pokemon cooped up in a place they didn't like. He let me play with one of his own, this yellow mousy thing he called a Pikachu. We got to run around in the pound, and my siblings even got in on it too. I never saw him again after that, and I think he probably got fired. The family was a lot less enthusiastic about being around me. The father, Ionices, whatever, couldn't bring himself to look at me more often than not. The mother had been so keen to hold me on her lap and show me off to whatever grandparent or aunt or uncle or cousin was visiting on a given day, but now she didn't want to touch me. The harness making it harder to pet me probably aided in that. Ed and Priscilla still continued to bother me with fashion designs, but they were less enthusiastic about it. It was like they only still did it to continue upholding some tradition. By the end of it, the final harness they had me wear was something that had been made special. Just for me. The mass of it all. Big pads that probably accounted for just as much as my entire body. You would have been forgiven for thinking I looked more like a Sandshrew or a Togedemaru than an Eevee at that point. The plates covered me up so much, only my face and the tip of my tail were clearly visible. I probably could have curled onto a ball and rolled. Walking in this was a little harder and actually dragged against the floor. I was still getting used to it when a break-in happened. One night, I was woken up by the sound of glass shattering somewhere in the mansion. My reflexes were home more by then, thus rousing me quickly in spite of the harness's encumbrance, while my siblings were still dazed for a little while longer. Our mother, though, she was already up on alert, hustling the others to keep them calm. When she came to me, she told me to keep them safe, and she left. The owners and the helping hands were already awake at that point, starting a commotion downstairs, mixed in with shrill, malevolent cackling, and soon my mother's yowling battle cry joined the fray as well. And then I heard her scream. I was out the door before any of the other EVs realized what happened. I nearly tumbled down the stairs on my clumsy rush, banged my head against the banister, and saw stars swim before my eyes. But I still kept soldiering on, regardless. The lights in the parlor dazzled me, but I could still see what happened. Two strange Pokemon in a room, black creatures with scarlet feathers, long, clipped, tipped fingers. Sneasels, I heard. and I could tell immediately that they weren't the same as the Mankey I'd seen before. Not just wild, but mean and cruel. The humans looked on from the edges of the room, aghast and stunned, too dumbstruck to move. Between them I saw my mother lying on the floor, with red gashes in her lilac fur. I roared as loud as my little lungs would allow me to. The Sneasels warbled madly as they came to meet me, closed the distance a lot more quickly than I could have, probably even without the harness. Ironically, the harness saved me in the initial assault. I was sluggish, but the padded plates were adequate enough to ward off the swipes of the claws. They even did me the service of tearing up all those blasted ribbons that had been tied to me. But the armor didn't do anything much to assist me in actually fighting them off. I charged desperately, swung with my tiny paws, but they were just too quick. They danced circles around me and made me look like I was nothing. It didn't help matters that I was worked up in a rage. I was reckless, and they were more aware of it than I was. They goaded me on, and one of them taunted me into a charge. And then not only would that one duck out of the way, but the other would take a rake at me, cutting off a chunk of the padded armor. I wasn't being terribly injured, but it was wearing down my stamina fast. The diminishing burden of the harness wasn't enough to offset that factor. They then managed to get a cut on my leg. It wasn't deep, but as for meager and exhausted as it was enough. I went down and I couldn't get back up again. But, again, the Sneasels weren't like that Mankey. They just weren't ready to let it go. They yammered maliciously as they picked me up together, drowning out my labored wails. The humans still weren't lifting a finger to do anything in midst of all this. The Sneasels then hurled me through the air, and I collided with one of the display cases, crashing through the see-through panel. I landed hard, more of the harness was knocked loose, and teeth of glass bit into my exposed skin. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline through my body that I experienced in my last battle. Terror racked through me. But something else landed on me in that moment. Of course, back then I didn't actually understand what evolution stones were. I barely even knew about evolution to begin with. When I saw a red-orange stone against my chest, flickering within, and pulses of bright light begin to fill my vision, my final thought was that I was dying. And then, I changed. My understanding of stone-based evolutions is that they're a lot different from other kinds. It's not a gradual process that happens over time. It's a rush of raw energy pouring into you all at once, altering you down to the very core of your being. At that moment, that was exactly the kind of thing I need. The weariness that clouded my senses fell away all at once. I felt distinctly that I was on fire, burning up from the inside out, and it wasn't pleasant at all. My body warped, bones sticking in a growth spurt that took a matter of seconds, fur growing out dramatically, and even my organs shifted subtly, making room for a new internal structure. I no longer felt hurt. I was no longer weak. I felt powerful. The world seemed smaller, just a little, as I stepped out from the debris of the display case. I was warmer, a whole lot warmer, but the warmth was one with me. It didn't cause me any discomfort. The Sneasels who had been so mercilessly beating me up were now taken aback, as astonished as my owners and retainers. My focus was more on them, so I didn't see whether my mother's eyes shifted and opened. She looked back at me in wonder. I only happened to catch a glimpse of myself in a reflection cast by one of the glass panels in the room. I looked like an Eevee, almost, but so much more extravagant. My fur was a deep burnt red, and the tufts around my chest and tail and forehead had grown exponentially larger in volume, as it turned into a bright yellow hair that flickered like fire. Never seen a Pokemon like that before, but I still knew what I was. I knew that it was me, a Flareon now. I gave out my cry again, deeper now, crackling with embers, and the Sneasels yelled back, too incensed to back down to even the face of my transformation. They still had the advantage of numbers on their side, and they were faster than me, but now they could no longer afford to risk a hit. I was wreathed in flames as I charged and swiped them. I didn't have to connect to scorch him. In the background, the humans were finally roused from their trance when they realized a fire was spreading, eating up dry wood in the old house. The Sneasels were now the ones being worn down by exhaustion. It didn't take long before I managed to knock down both of them. They were battered and bruised, but not enough that they couldn't limp away. I made sure to growl fiercely at them, pointing them out in the direction of the window they'd broken into in the first place. They vanished back into the night, leaving me alone in a burning room. My base instincts pulled on me again. I turned to inspect my mother again, and I saw her stirring. I was overjoyed. I almost forgotten the process leading up to this moment. Then something struck the side of my head and everything went black. When I came to my senses again, I was bound up in a more typical manner. A muzzle around my face, my legs were tied together by the ankles with thick cords. And to complete the image, I saw that I was surrounded by the black iron bars of a cage. The cage was in the kitchen, and as I lay there, I saw various helpers pacing in and out. There were noises coming from the parlors, sifting and grating, cleaning up the mess of battle. Eventually, Aloysius, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, came in. Wearing his pajamas, normally, even though he maintained a calm composure, but he's livid now. I thought his face was turning just as red as my new fur. He made it apparent that there was no way they'd let me leave now. I've gone from a pet to an investment, having effectively absorbed the value of a firestone that landed on me. And that was saying nothing about the damage to the parlor. Even after having defended the mansion and the residents from an attack, he didn't have any respect for me. He then took the cage upstairs to the pound. Wasn't gentle about it. He threw me down on the floor without a care. I fumed as I collected to myself, perhaps literally, as I felt the fire within me crackling angrily. I was of course already pondering the notion of escaping for the first time I had doubts. I had truly burned away any goodwill that had been left of me at this point. It was entirely likely that the consequences would be far more drastic now. But as I saw my siblings crowding around the cage in the midst then, my mother came forward. There were bandages around her, and there was a hobble in her step, but she seemed otherwise to be in good condition. Saw the usual maternal warmth in her gaze, gentle and comforting, and yet at the same time she struck me as being profoundly sad. Then her eyes and the crimson gem on her forehead pulsed with light, and the muzzle and knots tying me up came undone. There was a snap at the lock of the cage as it opened, allowing me freedom. I towered over my siblings now that I stepped out of the prison. I was just as tall as Mother. Although with my puffier fur, I appeared to be larger than her. The Eevees shrank away from me, confused and frightened, since they were just as ignorant of evolution as I had been, until Mother assured them of who I was. Some of them approached cautiously, quickly feeling the heat that I exuded, and they came up to snuggle against me, pushing deep into my fur. Altogether, there were nearly enough to push me over, and I laughed in their embrace, but this hardly lasted a few minutes before Mother interjected, and she led me away from them. "Did you know I used to be a champion?" she asked me. I nearly tripped over myself. She said that she had been a rare catch for the family, a female Eevee evolution that grew breeding and considerable accomplishments under her metaphorical belt. She had been a part of the professional league circuit for a few years. She earned quite a few ribbons and trophies, before retiring and then became adopted by the family in a mansion. She had always wanted to have a family, but she still sometimes missed the thrill of battle. She supposed that the excitement must have passed on to me and knew that I couldn't continue to stay any longer. We stood at the pound's door, and she put her paw on my forehead as her own glowed again. Images ran through my head, seeing the halls of the building and the men who patrolled it. The disembodied perspective weaved through them and continued to the parlor, where the debris has been cleaned up and the fires put out. But there's still a hole in one of the windows where the sneeze was broken in. "You see now the way that you must go. Act quickly," she told me, brushing along the side of my face before pushing me forward. "You don't belong in this terrible place, my nullifier. Go out there and chase your dreams." She continued to urge me as I went out. I'm not sure if she might have been telekinetically moving my limbs for me. I could only look back at her, and I was so unsure whether to say thank you or I love you that I couldn't say either. I can only hope that she heard my thoughts. "No, I'm fine. It's just I haven't thought about it in so long." Well, I did as her psychic intentions had commanded, predicting the movements of the human psyche sneaked by them unnoticed. I made into the parlor again. Well, how much easier it was to leap on the furniture now, and I made it through the window, and I was outside again. It had started to snow at some point during the night. Drifts of white were starting to blanket the mansion grounds. I didn't feel the cold much, thanks to my newfound internal heat and insulation. Flakes melted the water as soon as they came into contact with my fur, and I cleared the path ahead of myself, just walking forward, which the fresh snowfall would quickly cover up behind me. There would still be no alarm. Even when I reached the edge of the family's property, they would not discover I was missing until it was too late. So I ran on and on through the snow, through the forest, to the hills beyond. Whatever mysteries laid past even that. I have no idea what I was looking for, what I was going to do at that point, or how I would continue to survive. None of that mattered, not yet. In the moment, all that it was pointing me that was free. My fire had been lit and it will only continue to grow brighter and stronger. That's everything then. That's where I came from. Not so humble beginnings as it turns out, but I think it's still a rather unlikely road you have taken, all things considered. Don't worry. I've seen you got some questions. You're wondering why some humans own me, how they could own a Pokemon like any normal house pet. The truth was, it was a lot more than just a different time and place. It was a different world altogether. How's that for a plot twist? So, you want to know why I'm still not just a little fox about yay high? That's a story for another time. And now for some of the commentary. It's kind of a struggle with this particular one. There was a lot of run-on sentences that could have been fixed. I mean, there was a lot of commas that would have been just broken off and be different kind of sentences altogether. But so far, that's just one of my minor complaints. Other than that, this seems to be a pretty solid story. It really does give a good perspective. And it's a nice backstory for one of your OCs instead of just, it is what it is and you just might as well accept it. It is a pretty good story overall. If there is going to be a sequel to this that explains why instead of just a regular Flareon, she's now a Flareon Anthro, I'd be happy to see it. And I'll be happy to read it, and hell, even take money for it.